I thought my own mother loved me, until the day I discovered she'd been sabotaging my marriage behind my back. In a single moment, everything I believed about family, loyalty, and love shattered, and I realized I never truly knew the woman who raised me. Welcome to this story. Before we start, please hit that subscribe button, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story, and drop a comment below to let me know where you're watching from. Your support means the world, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. I can barely look at myself now. Every moment feels heavy, and I keep replaying the little signs I brushed aside, convincing myself she would never hurt me. The woman who raised me, the one I defended for years, was quietly tearing apart the one good thing I'd built. I'm sharing this because I don't want anyone else to excuse the warning signs the way I did. Sometimes love blinds us to the truth until it's almost too late. I grew up believing it was my responsibility to shield my mother from the world, to protect her secrets like they were my own. When I met Daniel, she smiled and pretended to approve, but there was always a sharpness beneath her sweetness. The snide jokes, the little digs, the constant reminders that no one could ever love me like she did. At the time, I excused it all as overprotectiveness. Only now do I see how deep that jealousy truly ran. The first time I felt something was truly wrong was so small at first that I almost dismissed it. It wasn't a row or a dramatic scene that would have made the problem obvious. It was a few words, offhand and careless, spoken by Daniel at the end of a Sunday lunch as if they were nothing at all. He mentioned a strange conversation he'd had with my mom that week. She'd told him I wasn't ready for marriage. Not in a joking way, not as a mother having a laugh. She said it as if it were a verdict. Daniel told me the remark casually, like it was a line from a play he'd overheard. And at the time, I laughed it off because it was easier to laugh than to let it sit in my chest and make the rest of the table thin and awkward. "Your mom said that?" I asked, and he nodded. He didn't say it with malice. He was puzzled more than anything. He loves my mother. He always has. At the time, I assumed he was telling me because he wanted my take, or because he wanted me to shrug it off with him. But the way he said it, soft, a little bewildered, was the first time I noticed that his face looked slightly different when he spoke about her. There was a softness to his voice that I'd never heard before when he talked about my family, as though he was measuring every word to avoid causing trouble. That small change felt like a fault line beneath my feet. My mother, Mary, brushed it off when I raised it later that evening. She made that small, practiced laugh of hers, the one she uses when she wants to make a problem disappear with charm rather than argument. "Oh, don't be daft," she said, stirring her tea as if the movement could smooth away the words. "I probably said it in jest. You know me, always worrying. I never meant anything by it." She sat like a woman delivering a verdict and then retreating as if her words had been nothing more than wind. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to tuck that moment away as one of those oddities you encounter with family, a misplaced comment, a maternal idiosyncrasy. But the edge of it remained, like a splinter you can't quite get out of your skin. I'd grown up with my mother's voice as a constant background to everything, a steadying commentary, an opinion offered when asked, and even when it wasn't. She'd raised me on her own for most of my childhood, and for years I'd told myself that the sacrifices she made justified a lot of the sharper edges of her personality. She'd worked bloody hard to give me a roof, clothes, school books. She'd been the woman who dried my tears and sat up with me when I had my first bout of flu. Those memories were heavy anchors. So when a tiny doubt surfaced, I told myself I must be overreacting. I was, after all, an adult now. I had a husband who adored me and a life I'd chosen. But over the next weeks, The remark lodged itself into the quieter parts of my head and began to fester. It showed itself in the way I found myself listening more closely to my mother's tone on the phone, waiting for the barbed edges. It showed in the way that Daniel seemed overly careful in her presence, like someone muffling his movements around a sleeping animal. And it showed in my own stomach, a slow, constant tightening I tried to pass off as nerves or fatigue or something else altogether less ugly. There were other little things too, tiny wedges of discomfort that in isolation seemed ridiculous to hold on to. Once, at my mother's house for tea, she offered an opinion about my wedding dress, not the kind of practical advice you'd expect, but something corrosive disguised as concern. "You can't possibly wear something so young," she'd said, turning the paper catalog as if the pictures were evidence in a trial. "People will talk. Daniel's family will talk. He'll think less of you." She didn't say it in a joking way. She said it with a certainty that felt like an instruction. I remember feeling my cheeks burn then, not just from the accusation, but from the implication that my happiness might be a thing to be judged and possibly revoked. Another evening, after a family dinner, my mother lingered a little too long with me while Daniel and his brother went to fetch dessert. She placed her hand on my arm and said in that low, measured voice, "Remember, love, you don't have to give up everything. Keep your own life. Don't let marriage change you." It sounded like maternal wisdom on the surface, but the tone was small and sharp, like an edge looking for a place to cut. It didn't feel supportive. It felt like sowing doubt. At first, I told myself she was just protective. Mothers are like that, aren't they? Protective to the point of officiousness. But protective can cross over into possessive in the smallest of ways. A comment here, a suggestion there, until it becomes a map of your future that someone else has drawn for you without asking. My mother had always liked to be central in any room, to be the person whose opinion mattered most. That had been part of how she survived. But this felt different. It felt like maneuvering. I began to notice patterns, tiny alignments of moments that gathered into a shape I couldn't yet name. She would turn up at Daniel's parents' events with a perfectly timed anecdote that undercut me. She would make a joke about how independent I was, too independent, in front of her sisters, and they would laugh in a way that left me small. Once she congratulated Daniel on his promotion in a way that made him uncomfortable. It was the kind of backhanded compliment that suggests to the recipient they don't quite measure up. Daniel never said anything to me about these things directly. He was too Britishly polite for that. But he did start moving his chair a fraction farther from my mother at the table, and I caught the way his jaw tightened when she spoke about me. What does sabotage look like in the early stages? I learned it's usually not the dramatic headline kind. It's soft and insinuating, a gradual repositioning of the furniture of your life so that someone else gets the best seat without anyone noticing the rearrangement. My mother never threw a tantrum in public. She didn't need to. She cultivated doubt and placed it like seeds in the soil of conversation. She would say a little thing here, a little thing there, a question about my cooking, a remark on my patience with my nephews, and let those little seeds sprout into a chorus of opinion that over time altered how people saw me. There were moments, too, when she would mask a dig as protectiveness disguised by nostalgia. "When I was your age," she would begin, and I would brace. "I knew what I wanted," she'd say, with a calm that suggested I was an experiment gone wrong. She was always generous with advice for others, but rarely for me unless it came with a caveat, a way of reminding me that she knew better. I started to feel boxed in, as if my choices were being measured against some invisible ruler that only she held. One Sunday afternoon, when Daniel and I were alone in the garden, He mentioned another conversation he'd had with my mother, this one more pointed than the last. He told me she'd suggested we wait a bit longer before trying for children, that maybe our careers were more important at the moment. At face value, it was sensible. Plenty of people decide to wait. But the way she'd phrased it, with that soft, theatrical worry, implied more than a schedule. It suggested she was curating our timeline, that she was deciding the pace, and by doing so, asserting a kind of control. Daniel shrugged, bewildered. He couldn't see the intent behind her softness. He didn't live with the ripple effects of her remarks. He only saw what he wanted to see, his mother-in-law's concern for her daughter's well-being. I, however, felt like a private life was being turned into a committee matter. On nights when the house was quiet and the children were still mere ideas, I would lie awake and replay the past week like a looped radio show. I'd pick at words, her jokes, that offhand comment about my wedding dress, the well-meant warning about marriage. I could rationalize it. My mother was a product of her past, after all. She'd been through hard times and had learned to survive by keeping a tight grip on the narrative of her life. Perhaps she feared being marginalized or overlooked once I married. Perhaps she was scared of losing the role she'd held for so long. There are compassionate explanations for everything. The thing about compassion is that it can be a blindfold when you're trying to see who someone truly is. One evening, I confronted her about it, partly because the little rusts in our relationship were now making the metal feel brittle. I remember standing in her little kitchen, the kettle clicking, the mugs steaming on the worktop, and asking directly, "Why did you tell Daniel I wasn't ready for marriage?" She sighed, a long, performed breath, and met my eyes with a look that was equal parts apology and dismissal. "I didn't say it like that," she replied smoothly. "I meant only that I worry, as any mother would. You know, it's a lot to change. You've always been so free, darling. I only want you to be sure." I could see the script she was following. Feign a heartfelt, reasonable concern, offer maternal wisdom, then retreat. It was an art she had perfected. But it wasn't the words that hurt me as much as the tone, that soft condescension that reduced me to a child who wasn't capable of making adult choices. Her insistence on framing herself as the concerned mother, rather than admitting she ever felt jealousy or discomfort, was the thing that really cut. "Don't patronize me," I said, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. "You made that comment to him. It was strange. Why would you say something like that if you weren't trying to influence how he thinks about me?" She looked affronted at that accusation, as though I'd accused her of grand theft. "Of course I wasn't trying to influence him," she said. "I'm his mother-in-law. It's natural to worry. I only want you to be happy. Why are you being like this?" Why was I being like this? Because the thing that scared me most was the dawning awareness that someone I had trusted implicitly might be acting in a way that chipped away at the foundation of my marriage, not in malice necessarily, but in something more private and corrosive: jealousy. There's a peculiar cruelty in jealousy from a parent. It is quiet, a short circuit of love, that rather than expand, contracts, making room for themselves rather than for your partner, making your relationship into a threat. After our conversation, I left feeling unsettled, but determined not to let it fester. I wanted to be above suspicion, to trust the woman who'd given me so much. So I resolved to test my feelings with action rather than accusation. I began to watch how she positioned herself in social settings. I noticed the way she would, quite deliberately, tell certain stories about me that cast me as impulsive or flighty in front of Daniel's colleagues. A story about a youthful mistake would be molded into evidence I was somehow irresponsible. A detail I'd confided in her would be repeated with a nuance that made it a warning rather than a confession. I remember one incident clearly. We were at a small celebration for Daniel's promotion, a casual gathering at his sister's flat with friends and colleagues. My mother had come. She was dressed in a blouse she knew drew attention, the one she wore when she wanted to be noticed. Over the course of the evening, she managed with effortless skill to position herself in every crucial conversation. People laughed at her anecdotes, and she always mentioned me at the right moment in a way that diminished me without seeming to. At one point, she leaned over to Daniel's cousin and said, with that rakish, concerned air, "You don't want to end up like some wives I know, giving up too much at the drop of a hat." It was casual. It was a throwaway. But the room shifted. The smiles tightened, and I found myself shrinking in my seat. Daniel noticed, of course. He shot me a look across the room, one of apology and frustration, and I could see his discomfort. He later told me that evening that he felt awkward because of my mother's comments. She, on the other hand, made a show of worry. "I only worry because I love you," she said to me later, pressing my hand. Her hand was cold, the pressure light, as if she were testing whether I would flinch. It wasn't only public slips of the tongue. There were times when she would frame my choices as if they were recklessness, leaving subtle fingerprints on family conversations. When I spoke about a plan with Daniel, say, an idea for a small renovation or holiday, the next time she saw Daniel, she'd mention casually and with a fatalistic tone how impractical my ideas sounded. It was the tiny undermining that gnawed away at confidence. I started to second-guess myself. I began to wonder whether my instincts were reliable, whether I was, in fact, being hasty. And that, perhaps more than anything, was her goal, to make me uncertain of my own judgment, so that others might doubt me too. I should have confronted her more forcefully then. Perhaps if I had stood my ground, made a scene, exposed what I now suspected, it would have stopped. But that's not how my mother and I had always worked. She'd built our relationship on a mixture of obligation and performance. She would give, and I would be grateful. She would scold, and I would accept. She would grandstand, and I would smile. Breaking that cycle felt like treason, an affront to the woman who'd put me through university and who, in more ways than one, had kept me afloat in rough times. The guilt of confronting her was massive. There was shame in considering that my loyalty, so often a source of pride, might have been misplaced. So, instead, I watched, and I waited, and I gathered. I started keeping in mind the timings of her remarks, the audiences she chose, the way she couched things in humor or maternal care. Patterns emerged. There was a careful choreography to her words. She spoke of me in ways that undermined me in front of Daniel's friends, and she gently suggested delays and doubts in private conversations with him. Little coincidences piled up. A remark from his sister about how ready Daniel's friends thought he was for married life, and aside from his mother about how girls these days rush into things. A sympathetic voice that pointed out, subtly, that perhaps I wasn't truly understanding the seriousness of our decisions. And I began very quietly to keep notes. It felt absurd at first, like something a paranoid person would do, but there was a method to it. I cataloged the comments, the dates, the witnesses. I wrote down the circumstances in my phone notes and would read them back late at night when the house was quiet. The list felt ridiculous and petty until it didn't. There was a slow, awful pattern.
It wasn't just random maternal worry, it was a pattern of influence. And influence can be destructive in a way that's almost invisible.
There was one afternoon when everything shifted in a more concrete way. I was at home, trying to arrange details for our wedding registry, when my sister called me. She sounded flustered, embarrassed. "Have you spoken to Mum about the seating plan?" she asked. And I could hear Daniel's aunt in the background making tea, the shrill noise of china in the call like punctuation to the conversation. "She's been telling everyone that maybe the best thing is to keep the ceremony small. Just family. She says big weddings can go wrong. She's been telling people you'd be overwhelmed." I stared at the phone, feeling suddenly dizzy. My mother had told other family members, people I didn't expect, things she hadn't discussed with me, ways to circumscribe my day, to shape it into something safe and small, and crucially, something she could oversee. It dawned on me then that this wasn't about concern alone, it was about control. She wanted to manage what my life looked like so she could remain central to it. When I confronted her that evening, "Why are you telling people what our wedding should be like?" she looked affronted, wounded in a way that made me soften despite myself. "I'm trying to help, love. I just want to make sure it's not too much for you. It's your day, after all." But the matter-of-fact way she'd enlisted others gave her away. She was orchestrating a narrative among the family about what was best for me, and that narrative relegated my voice to the background. And so, the first crack in my trust widened. It didn't explode into a confrontation, not yet. There were no raised voices or dramatic accusations. Instead, there was a slow coldness, a recalibration of the terrain where my marriage and my family intersected. I felt encircled not by open battle, but by 1,000 small, piercing comments that made my position, my authority in my own life, feel precarious. I realized, with a kind of stunned clarity, that I had been protecting her secrets for so long that I'd stopped listening for the ones she kept to herself. Protecting a parent's secrets is a complicated thing. There is gratitude in it, a recognition of what they sacrificed. But there is also danger when protection becomes complicity, when you take the bruises intended for them and wear them as if they're yours. I had been complicit for years. I had smoothed over stories, explained away odd behavior, laughed when perhaps I should have questioned. That had been my way of honoring her, of keeping peace. But the pattern had shifted. Her actions were no longer about survival, they were about maneuver. As the weeks passed, the slow erosion continued. I found myself watching Daniel more closely, not with suspicion toward him, but with a dawning sorrow as I realized he was being nudged, pushed, and guided by a woman who loved me, but in a way that made less room for us. There were times when I imagined myself stepping in, making a scene, asking Daniel plainly if he'd noticed how my mother seemed to be undermining me. But even as I thought it, I felt a physical restraint, fear of being seen as ungrateful for the love she'd given, fear of splitting the family in a way that would make life messy and complicated. That fear kept me quiet. The first breach of trust doesn't announce itself. It settles in like a second layer of skin, hardening around your original self, until you have to peel it back to find who you were beneath. I found myself performing in a different way around my mother, modulating my laughter, tempering my speech, and acquiescing on matters that, before, I would have insisted upon. I started to measure my own desires against an imaginary set of standards that I assumed she held. I began to live in anticipation of her opinion, rather than in the certainty of my own. I can't pretend I didn't love her in that early period after I first sensed the betrayal. Love is stubborn, and it's threaded through memory and obligation. I would still catch myself smoothing her hair from her face at Christmas, still laughing at the stories that once made my face ache with mirth. But alongside that love lived a new, bitter awareness that my mother, the woman whose lap had been my refuge, was capable of choosing her desires in ways that didn't include my happiness. That possibility felt like an amputation. By the time this chapter of our lives closed,
by which I mean by the time my discomfort hardened into conviction that something had to change, I had become vigilant. I had learned to read between the lines in family conversations. I had begun to test her statements, to ask Daniel afterwards what he thought, to refuse to accept her offhanded advice as benign. It was exhausting living like that, continually assessing the intentions of the person who'd once been my first home. I don't think this moment was a sudden betrayal as much as a revelation. The discovery that a loved one could, whether consciously or unconsciously, begin to carve away at the architecture of my life. That first crack, a comment about me not being ready for marriage, taught me a terrible lesson about the small ways in which trust can be undermined. It taught me that people you love can hurt you in ways that get dressed up as care. And it taught me painfully that loyalty is not always reciprocal. At the end of that long week, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold and my phone full of the notes that I'd been keeping. The list read like a map of small betrayals. I felt ridiculous and righteous at once. There was a dirty, complicated sense of anger beneath the sadness. For all my mother had given, I realized I had to choose my own life now, to defend my marriage and my choices. It felt monstrous and necessary. I didn't know then what the next step would be. I didn't know whether I would confront her in a way that could dismantle their relationship entirely, or whether I would try instead to erect new boundaries. I only knew that the trust I'd once taken for granted had been fractured, and that living as if nothing had changed was not an option. The small comment had opened a door I could never close. That first breach was the beginning of a lengthening story. It was the moment the ground shifted underfoot, the moment I realized that loyalty can be complicated and love can conceal hurt. It was the first time I saw my mother not merely as protector, but as a person with her own tangled imperfections. And it was the first time I understood that sometimes protecting someone means stepping back and seeing them clearly, flaws and all. I used to pride myself on keeping the peace. It felt like my job. Not a job anyone signed up for, more a habit, a reflex. When Daniel and I married, I promised myself I would be the bridge between everyone, between his loud family and my quiet one, between his opinions and my need for calm. For a long time it worked. People liked that I could smooth edges, make awkwardness disappear with a cup of tea and a steady voice. I thought that made me strong. I thought that made me a good daughter and a good wife.
Then the little things started. At first, they were almost laughably small. A remark at Sunday lunch about something Danielle supposedly did that didn't fit with the man I knew. A throwaway line about him being careless with money or impatient with me. I'd glance at him across the table and see that look, a slight tightening at the eyes, the same expression he wore when he'd realized he'd been misheard. When I asked him later, he would blink and give me an honest, puzzled reply, and I'd feel foolish for even bringing it up. But the next day, there would be another comment, this time from someone else, or a half-remembered story that had acquired a new spin. Mom started turning up at our house on those days. Not a polite message saying she was calling in for a cup of tea, but walking through the front door as if she'd lived there forever. She'd be frazzled, her cardigan inside out from rushing, lipstick smudged from wiping at her eyes. She would sit down and make a production of being wounded. "I just feel left out, love," she'd say, voice wobbling. "You never invite me to things anymore." Then, almost theatrically, she'd direct the conversation towards Daniel, as though I hadn't noticed her arrival was timed to coincide with the latest slight. "You know what he's like," she'd tell whoever was within earshot, folding her fingers in on the teacup as if that would keep her upright. "Always rushing, always impatient. Not the sort of man to settle down, is he?" She'd laugh then, a brittle, practiced laugh, and glance at me for the subtext I was supposed to supply, the apology, the explanation. I would give her one of those answers, the kind that sounded conciliatory but meant nothing. "Oh, Mom, you're being dramatic." Meanwhile, Daniel would stand in the kitchen doorway, trying not to make a scene, his face lined with that polite confusion I had come to hate. He trusted us both. He trusted me more than I deserved. At first, I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Mothers are complicated, I told myself. She'd had a tough life. She'd sacrificed for me. Maybe what I took for manipulation was just loneliness, or an old habit of making herself the center of things. I had grown up being the person to smooth over her storms, to hand her the calm towel while she dried her tears. I thought I knew how to soothe her. I thought I could manage all of it and keep our marriage untouched. It didn't help that Mom's comments were always wrapped in concern. "I just want the best for you, darling," she'd say. And the words would sting because they sounded like love. But her concern came with a twist, an implication that I wasn't capable, that Daniel deserved better in ways I didn't understand. She would make those sideways remarks at family gatherings, loud enough for people to hear, but small enough to be dismissible. "Oh, marriage is hard for some people, isn't it?" Or, "Some women aren't ready for the real work of being a wife." People would look, shift in their seats, and then change the subject. Daniel would look at me as if to say, "Is this true?" And I would offer a tired, embarrassed smile. When arguments sparked, they were about insignificant things: a mislaid set of keys, a missed call, a forgotten bill. But Mom would arrive within those hours, phone in hand, breathless with a tale of Daniel's recklessness, often exaggerated, sometimes invented. She had a way of recounting it that made ordinary things sound calamitous. I found myself defending him more and more, explaining away his foibles, while still feeling the cold needle of unease. It's strange how your loyalty can be tugged in opposite directions, to the woman who birthed you and the man you chose to spend your life with. At home, in the quiet between the nights when Mom appeared, Daniel and I would sit on the sofa and try to make sense of it. "She's been odd lately," he'd say, hands wrapped around a mug, staring at the steam, as if the answers were written there. "He told me you weren't ready for marriage," he said one evening, voice low and careful. I felt a squeeze in my chest, an odd, immediate defensiveness that surprised me more than him did. "She didn't mean it like that," I managed, because my mouth had developed a habit of excusing hurt. "She's probably just worried. She always does this." He searched my face then, and there was a moment where I wanted to drop the armor. I wanted to tell him everything about the texts she'd sent, the way she'd laughed when a mutual friend mentioned my supposed failings, how she'd once suggested that perhaps our marriage was a mistake. But I didn't. Seeing the strain on his face, I worried my confession would be another burden. So I tucked it away and tried to clean the hurt with practicalities. "Let's go for a walk," I suggested. Or, "We can call her tomorrow, sort it out." We did the practical things like a team, but the rot that was not spoken of kept gnawing at the edges. You learn a lot about people when you watch how they behave in public and private. Mom's public persona was well honed. She was the doting, worried mother to anyone who would listen. Privately, she had a sharper tone, a knack for planting doubts. I remember one Sunday when she cornered me in the kitchen after everyone had left, her voice small and conspiratorial. "You know, love," she said, eyes flicking to the sink. "I just worry you'll end up unhappy, and I'd hate to think I did nothing." She reached out and touched my arm in a gesture that felt sold separately from the words. Sometimes people aren't ready for what marriage demands. I felt the breath leave my body and a small sigh. It wasn't only the words. It was the timing, too. Mom's appearances would cluster around the weeks when Daniel and I were under pressure. When he was preparing for an important meeting and took his stress home, she would be there the next day to point out his impatience. When I was navigating something at work, so would she to remark on his inability to be supportive. The pattern became hard to ignore. She was always there, a constant commentator on our faults, a person who could turn a small disagreement into a justification for her belief that I was somehow failing at life. I first blamed myself for seeing it all as deliberate. I told myself she was lonely, that I was being cruel to assume malice. But as these things accumulated, the doubt hardened into something less forgiving. Daniel began to withdraw. He trusted me, yes, but the seeds Mom planted had an effect. He started checking his messages more often, looking for evidence of the stories I'd been too ashamed to admit I'd heard. He would sit up late, staring at his phone, trying to understand how his actions had been recast into tales of neglect. And then there were the friends. People we'd known for years started making odd comments in passing, often prefaced with, "Not that I'm saying anything," an odd preface that always meant the opposite. A member of my book club would ask in that soft voice women use when they want to sound sympathetic, "Is everything really all right at home?" Another friend would raise an eyebrow when I mentioned a quiet evening together and say, "Men can be so thoughtless sometimes." They meant well. They thought they were just sharing concern. What they didn't know was who had nudged those concerns into being. It's amazing how easily a narrative can be spun when someone is intent on telling it. Mom had a talent for weaving a version of reality that she controlled. She would tell one person a tiny truth and another a slightly altered version, and soon enough the little lies had muscles. People start to believe things if they hear them enough. I watched friendships rearrange themselves around the stories she handed out. Invitations dwindled, overnight plans dried up. Our lives subtly constricted to the size of the tale she preferred. I tried to confront it at first in little, cautious ways. A message here, a careful question there. "Mom," I said once over tea, "you said something to Daniel that upset him. Why would you tell him I'm not ready?" She looked at me with an expression I recognized from childhood, wounded and instantly the center of the room. "I'm only concerned," she said. "I don't want to see you hurt. I must be honest when I see things." Her voice had that practiced pitch of righteousness. The conversation ebbed away with me apologizing, as always, because it was easier to smooth the waters than to make waves. Things reached a new level when she started sending anonymous notes. They were carefully worded, never signed, and always full of the gentle condemnation she used when she meant to wound. Sometimes they turned up tucked into a neighbor's post or a friendly acquaintance's handbag. The notes said things that were true, but framed to look disastrous, that Daniel had been seen with an older woman, that he had spent money on things I wasn't aware of, that perhaps I had been naive. The person who received the note would call me, voice low, tentative, and I would feel my stomach drop as I tried to explain, to correct, to make them see the truth. Each time I did, the damage had already been done.
I think the moment I realized this wasn't simply maternal worry was the afternoon I found a small, crumpled receipt in my coat pocket from a cafe I'd never been to. It wasn't addressed to anyone, but its presence felt deliberate, like a breadcrumb meant to be found. Its timing coincided with a row Daniel and I had that morning about nothing important, the kind of row you have when words are sharp and patience thin. Mom had been missing from the conversation, and yet her presence was now felt like a third set of hands pulling at the seams of our life. By then, the cracks were not just in my marriage, but in me. I had begun to doubt my own instincts. If my mother could be so sly in her undermining, what else had I believed that wasn't true? I retreated into a careful, performative calm, answering calls with composed phrases, smiling at family gatherings while inside my chest something small and brittle kept breaking. My sleep was shallow, my appetite small. I felt unmoored, as if the foundations I had trusted all my life were made of sand. It's strange how love can be both anchor and chain. I loved my mother. That never changed. She had given me the marrow of who I was, but love doesn't render you blind to harm. There are times when love is the very reason you must protect yourself. I found myself balancing on that thin line between protecting the person who made me who I was and protecting the life I had built with Daniel. I tried to be fair, to hear my mother out, to give her the benefit of doubt. But fairness has its limits when someone systematically rewrites your life in whispers. Months passed, nights of holding my breath and watching the way people looked at Daniel differently after a friendship had dissolved following one of those anonymous notes. The cracks in my relationship with Daniel began to show more and more. It started off subtly, little snide comments that didn't seem to make sense at first. "Daniel said he's too busy again, huh?" Mum would ask, her tone dripping with something between concern and judgment. "Oh, well, I guess that's what happens when you're in a relationship." I'd brush it off, tell her it wasn't true, that Daniel had simply been swamped with work. But the doubt she planted in my mind didn't go away. The more she said these things, the more I started to question what was going on behind the scenes. Before you continue listening, if you're enjoying the journey, please take some seconds to show my support by subscribing. Your subscription means a lot to me and my channel. It helps keep these stories alive, and without you, there's no way I can continue sharing the twists, the turns, and the raw moments that speak to the heart. Please don't leave me hanging. Subscribe now. Thank you. Daniel and I began fighting more. It was like a slow burn, these little misunderstandings snowballing into bigger arguments. Something shifted in us. When we weren't fighting, we were barely speaking. Our conversations felt heavy, loaded with all the things we weren't saying, the things I wasn't addressing. I could feel him pulling away, but I didn't understand why. It was Mum, though, who seemed to be the most vocal about planting seeds of doubt in my mind. "Are you sure he's loyal?" she would ask, her voice low, almost conspiratorial. "He's not who you think he is." I'd stare at her, trying to brush it off, but her words lingered long after she had spoken them. The woman who had raised me, the one I trusted more than anyone, was now the one who made me question the very man I loved. And that hurt more than I could admit. I found myself torn in two. On one side, there was Daniel, the man I had built a life with who had shown me love in ways I hadn't known existed. On the other side, there was my mother, the one who had always been there for me, who had raised me single-handedly. I loved her, but she was now casting doubt on everything that I thought was solid. The loyalty I had for her felt like it was being ripped away thread by thread with each new comment. But she was my mother, and I was supposed to trust her, wasn't I? To make matters worse, Daniel's family started acting cold, distant. I couldn't understand why. Whenever I visited them, I could feel the tension in the room, the strained politeness, the sidelong glances. It was like they were holding something back, something they weren't telling me. At first, I thought it was just in my head, that maybe they didn't really approve of me, or maybe they were just worried about our relationship. But it didn't feel like that. It felt like something deeper. I asked Daniel about it one night after a particularly uncomfortable dinner with his family. He brushed it off, claiming they were just stressed about other things and that I was reading too much into it. But the coldness in their eyes didn't go away. I could feel it every time I saw them, this subtle shift that I couldn't ignore. They were hiding something from me, and I had no idea what. It wasn't until a few weeks later that I began to realize something was off. One evening, when Daniel was out, I found myself sitting with Mum in the living room, her eyes darting around as though she was waiting for me to ask the question. And I did, not knowing what I was getting myself into. "Mum," I said slowly, "is there something you're not telling me? Is there something wrong with Daniel's family?" She froze for a moment, her lips tight, as if she had to keep herself from saying too much. She cleared her throat and then looked at me, the mask of concern slipping for just a second. "Don't worry, love," she said, her voice smooth. "They're just being difficult. But I've always had my suspicions about him, you know. I'm just looking out for you." The words hung in the air, thick with unspoken meaning. I had no idea what she was implying, but I knew it wasn't good. And yet I didn't push further. I couldn't. Part of me still clung to the belief that my mother was only looking out for me, but something was shifting inside me. Something was unraveling, and I wasn't sure if I could stop it. What I didn't know then was that Mum wasn't just feeding me doubts about Daniel. She was hiding something much more dangerous. It wasn't just her concern for me that had been behind her actions. It was jealousy, and the truth would come crashing down in a way I could never have predicted. But for now, all I could do was watch as the life I thought I had began to slip away, piece by piece. Our finances took a hit, and with it, so did the fragile trust that had once held us together. It seemed like every time we tried to catch our breath, another wave of stress would come crashing down. Daniel and I had always been able to work through the tough times, side by side, but now everything felt like it was falling apart, bit by bit. A late-night argument about the bills that had gone unpaid, followed by awkward silence at the dinner table the next evening. Then came the phone calls, the ones that Daniel was taking in another room with his voice lowered, too low for me to make out, but high enough to sound strained. I tried to ignore it at first, convinced it was just stress getting the better of us. But when the phone calls became more frequent, the strain between us thickened. I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was off, but I didn't know how to ask.
The tension in our home began to spill into our everyday lives. I felt it in the way Daniel looked at me sometimes, as though I had become a stranger to him. It was in the awkward silences that fell between us when we weren't fighting, the looks he exchanged with his family, his friends. I couldn't tell if it was guilt or confusion, but it felt like he was pushing me away.
One evening, after yet another row about money, I stood there in the kitchen, the weight of everything pressing down on me. It felt like we were both holding on to something that was already broken, and I was afraid of what might happen if we let go. I could see the exhaustion in Daniel's eyes, the way he clenched his fists, trying to keep himself together. I had to know. I needed to know what was going on. "Daniel, what's happening?" I asked, my voice quieter than usual. "Why are we doing this? Why are you pulling away?" He didn't answer at first. He just stared at me, his gaze distant, as if he were looking at something far beyond me. The room was quiet for a long moment, save for the sound of our breath heavy with unspoken words. "I'm sorry," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I can't keep doing this." My heart sank. I wasn't sure what he was referring to, our arguments, our finances, or something else, but I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "I can't take the pressure anymore, Laura," he said, his voice cracking, something raw and fragile in it. "Someone's been telling me lies about you, things I didn't want to believe." The words hit me like a slap across the face. My breath caught in my chest, and for a moment, the world seemed to freeze. Lies? What lies? I couldn't even wrap my head around what he was saying. Was this about my mother? Had she said something to him too? The realization that she might have been behind this made my stomach churn. I didn't want to believe them, but I'm so confused, Laura. I don't know what to think anymore. I looked at him, my mind racing. What kind of lies? Who had been talking to him? Had Mum gotten into his head? Had she twisted everything around until it made me seem like the villain? I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but something inside me held me back. What was I supposed to say? "I'm not who they're saying I am," I whispered, my voice trembling with frustration. "I haven't done anything, I swear it." Daniel didn't look convinced. He ran his hand through his hair, the stress of it all visibly wearing him down. I could see how much this was eating at him. how much this was eroding the trust we'd once had. But even then, something inside me began to crack. If Mum was behind this, I didn't know what to do. How could I defend myself against something so far out of my control? "I know you didn't," he said, his voice softer now. "But I've heard things. Things that I can't just ignore." The air felt thick between us, the distance widening. It was like all the years of love, of trust were crumbling beneath us, and we were powerless to stop it. "Who's telling you these things?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. Not even sure I wanted to know the answer. "I can't. I don't want to say," he murmured, his eyes avoiding mine. "I don't want to believe it, but it's hard not to, Laura. It's hard not to see the signs." And just like that, I knew. I knew, deep down, that my mother had been planting those seeds. The jealousy I'd brushed off for so many years had finally seeped into every part of our lives, into my relationship with Daniel. And now it seemed like my mother's words had become more than just words. They were truths in Daniel's eyes, and that truth was tearing us apart. I felt lost. I wanted to scream, to tell him everything, but I couldn't. It wasn't just about proving my innocence anymore. It was about what had been broken, what had been poisoned, and how I had no idea how to fix it. I looked at him, my heart in my throat. "I love you, Daniel. I really do, but I can't fight this alone. I can't fix what's not even mine to fix." His eyes were filled with so many emotions, but none of them were the love I once saw there. There was pain, confusion, and above all, doubt. And that was the hardest part to swallow. That after everything we'd been through, after everything I'd given, he didn't know if he could trust me anymore. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Our finances, our relationship, my mother's lies. It all felt like it was too much to carry. How had we come to this? How had everything we built fallen apart so quickly? The doubt that had been planted in Daniel's mind wasn't just a small crack anymore. It had grown into something much bigger, something I didn't know how to fight. I was losing him, and that thought tore me apart. But that was only the beginning. The betrayal was far deeper than I ever imagined, and I didn't know how much longer I could stand on this fragile ground before it all shattered beneath me. The night I found the messages, everything came crashing down. I was supposed to be getting ready for bed, the same as any other night, but something in the air felt different, charged, like everything was on the edge of breaking, waiting for something to push it over. I didn't know it then, but I was about to discover the truth, a truth that would rip apart everything I had ever believed about love, trust, and family. It wasn't even a big moment at first, just a quiet evening. I was rummaging through a drawer in the spare room, looking for some old photos for a family album I had promised to put together. But as I reached past a few unopened bills and some receipts, my fingers brushed against something familiar. An old phone that Mum had kept in a box for years. It was an old model, cracked screen, the kind of thing that she had tossed aside when she'd upgraded to the new one. I had always thought she had kept it for sentimental reasons, but that night I felt drawn to it. Maybe it was the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe it was the weight of all the unspoken tension, but something urged me to pick it up. I didn't think much of it at first. The phone had long since been deactivated, so it's not like I could even use it to make calls. But as I flicked through the messages, hoping to find some silly texts or photos from years ago, I stumbled across something that made my heart stop. The first message I saw was from Daniel. He was asking her, "Is everything okay with Laura? She's been acting distant lately. I'm just not sure what to do." At first, I didn't understand. Why was Daniel texting my mom like this? They'd always been friendly enough, but why would he ask her about me? And why would he need reassurance from her? I felt an icy chill creep over me, but I kept scrolling, needing to know more. That's when I saw it. The messages that shattered everything. One text from my mum read, "I think she's planning to leave you. I've seen the way she's been acting. She's not the woman you think she is. I don't think she's faithful. I wouldn't trust her, Daniel." I couldn't breathe. The world felt like it was closing in around me. I read the words over and over, but they didn't make any sense. She had been saying these things behind my back to Daniel, my own mother?
Then the next message was even worse. "I know she doubts you. I've seen the way she looks at you sometimes. She thinks she's too good for you. If I were you, I wouldn't trust her with my heart. She's already pulling away." I felt sick to my stomach. The messages came flooding in one after another. It was like she had been planting seeds of distrust for months, maybe even years, twisting every little insecurity I had and turning it into a weapon to use against both of us. Every single message was another twist of the knife, each one more calculated than the last. I couldn't even bring myself to read the rest. How had I been so blind? How had I missed this? All those little arguments, all those late-night fights that had seemed to come out of nowhere, was this what she had been doing all along? Was this her doing? I could feel the rage building inside me, but it was a quiet kind of anger, the kind that left you numb. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, but I didn't. Instead, I sat there, frozen, holding it in my hands, unable to move. I thought of all the times she had whispered in my ear, telling me things that made me doubt Daniel, the way she would talk about his family, about his past, always with that worried tone in her voice, as if I had to be careful, as if I couldn't trust him. All those times I'd brushed it off, told myself it was just her being overprotective, just her worrying too much. But now, looking at those messages, I realized it was never about protecting me. It had never been about love or care. It had been about control, about manipulation, about keeping me under her thumb. The worst part was that I never saw it coming. I trusted her with my life. She was my mother. How could she do this to me? To Daniel? To our marriage? I spent hours that night in the dark, replaying every moment of my life that had led up to this. Every conversation, every tiny shift in our relationship that had seemed so small, so insignificant at the time. How had I been so naive? I couldn't even look at Daniel the next day. The hurt was so fresh, so raw, that I couldn't bear to even be in the same room with him. I didn't know how to talk to him. How could I explain this? How could I even begin to tell him that the woman who had raised me, who had been my rock, had been the one to tear us apart from the inside? He had no idea what was happening, no idea that my mother had been sabotaging us for so long, and yet here I was, holding the pieces of my shattered world, and I didn't know how to put them back together. It wasn't just the lies that hurt either. It wasn't just the betrayal of trust. It was the fact that this had been going on for years. It was the fact that I had been unknowingly complicit in my own destruction. My mother had manipulated both of us, turned us against each other, feeding me doubt and mistrust. And the worst part was that I had let it happen. I still couldn't believe it. It felt like I was in a nightmare, unable to wake up. I had spent so many years loving and trusting her, and now everything felt tainted. I couldn't go back, couldn't undo the damage that had been done. The thing about betrayal is that it doesn't always come from the people you expect. Sometimes the ones you love the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. And no matter how much you try to fix things, no matter how much you try to patch things up, the cracks are always there, waiting to remind you of what's broken. As I sat there, holding my mother's phone, the weight of everything hit me. I knew that my life, my marriage, everything I had worked so hard to build was on the brink of collapse, and I didn't know how to save it. But this wasn't just the end of my relationship with Daniel. This was the end of something far deeper. It was the end of my blind trust, my unconditional loyalty to someone who didn't deserve it. And in that moment, I realized something I never thought I'd have to. sometimes you have to choose yourself. That night marked the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter I didn't ask for, but one that would shape the rest of my life. And I didn't know where it would lead me, but I knew one thing for sure. Everything had changed. The collapse happened so suddenly it took me by surprise, like a wall crumbling with no warning. One minute, everything seemed salvageable. There was still hope. There was still some sense of normalcy. And the next, the weight of everything that had been hidden came crashing down. Daniel and I sat there in our living room, the space that had once felt warm and safe, now colder than ever. I could see it in his eyes, the disbelief, the hurt. He wasn't just angry at my mother, though that anger was certainly there. He was angry with me, with himself, with the whole situation. He felt like the fool, and in a way, so did I. I had thought all these years that I had everything figured out. I had trusted my mom with every part of myself. Every secret, every insecurity, she was the one person I thought I could turn to without hesitation. But now, sitting there in the stark silence of our living room, I realized that I hadn't just been betrayed by my mother, I had betrayed myself. Daniel stared at the floor, his shoulders heavy with unspoken words. I could see him trying to make sense of it, just as I was trying to do, but there was no logic to what had happened. There was no way to explain away the years of manipulation, the lies, the ways my mother had systematically poisoned the trust between us. He felt like the fool, and in a way, so did I. I wanted to reach out to comfort him, but I knew I couldn't fix this. There was no comforting in the world that could make this right. I had lost the one person I thought I could always count on, and in the process, I had lost myself. I sat there, my thoughts spinning out of control. I felt numb, disconnected from everything. I wasn't even sure who I was anymore. The woman who had stood by Daniel, who had promised to build a life with him, she seemed so far away now, like a different person. The hardest part wasn't seeing Daniel's pain. It wasn't even the hurt in his eyes, the way he seemed to look through me rather than at me. The worst part was realizing that I could no longer trust the very foundation of everything I had built. My own mother had shattered that, and now the pieces of my life lay in front of me, scattered, broken.
Our marriage, which had once felt so strong, was now bruised, battered by years of manipulation. The home we had made together, the one place that should have felt like refuge, now felt cold, empty. It felt like there was a shadow hanging over everything we did. We moved through the motions, talking, eating, sharing space, but it wasn't the same. The warmth had gone. The connection was fraying, and I didn't know how to stitch it back together. I could barely function, let alone be the partner I needed to be. Every time I looked at Daniel, I saw his disappointment, his hurt, and I couldn't blame him for it. I was just as disappointed in myself. I had allowed the lies, the manipulation to creep in and destroy everything. The weight of the heartbreak was more than I could bear. I thought I had understood what betrayal felt like before. When people talked about betrayal, they talked about cheating, or lies, or broken promises. But this was different. This was from the one person who was supposed to love me unconditionally. My mother's betrayal wasn't just about the lies she'd told Daniel or the things she'd whispered behind my back. It was about the way she had broken the trust between us, the way she had shown me that even the closest relationships could be poisoned by jealousy. As much as I wanted to blame her, there was part of me that couldn't ignore the fact that I had allowed it. I had ignored the red flags, overlooked the cracks, brushed off the things I didn't want to face. I had trusted her more than I trusted myself, and that was the hardest truth of all. I tried to sleep that night, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face, her words echoing in my head. I saw her twisted smile, the way she had acted like everything was fine when in reality she had been tearing us apart. And what hurt the most was that I couldn't even confront her. I couldn't ask her why. I couldn't demand answers, because deep down, I knew she wouldn't admit it. She would never take responsibility for what she had done. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to fix this. My world had collapsed, and I was standing at the center of the wreckage, unsure how to move forward. The trust I had placed in my mother was gone, and so was the trust I had in myself. I questioned everything: my worth, my judgment, the choices I'd made. Had I been foolish all along? Was I so desperate for love and approval that I had ignored the signs, the things I didn't want to see? There was no easy answer. There was no way to just sweep this under the rug and pretend it hadn't happened. My relationship with Daniel was broken, and I was the one who had to figure out how to fix it. But that meant, first, I had to figure out how to trust myself again. I had to understand that I wasn't to blame for my mother's choices. I had to accept that she wasn't the person I thought she was, and neither was I. It was a hard pill to swallow, but it was the first step towards healing. I wasn't just healing my marriage anymore, I was healing myself. And that would take time, more time than I had ever expected. But through all the heartbreak, I knew one thing. I had to start by setting boundaries. Not just with Daniel, but with my mother too. I had to choose myself, even if it meant walking away from the person I had loved most in my life. And maybe, just maybe, that would allow me to rebuild my life piece by piece until I was whole again. That wasn't going to be easy, but it was the only way forward. And as much as I feared what the future held, I also knew it was the only way to reclaim my life. I didn't know where I would end up, but I couldn't stay in this place anymore. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it was all falling apart. It wasn't just about fixing my marriage anymore. It was fixing me. I had tried to avoid this moment. The truth had been gnawing at my soul, biting deeper into my soul with each passing day. But finally, there I was, standing in front of my mother, the woman who raised me, loved me, and yet betrayed me in ways I could never have imagined. I'd spent my whole life trying to protect her secrets, believing that family loyalty was something sacred, something that could never be broken. But in the end, I realized I had been protecting the wrong person, and it was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I had to confront her. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind countless times, playing out every possible scenario. What would I say? How would I make her see what she'd done? How could I explain the depth of the hurt, the damage she had caused to the woman who had always been my anchor? But no amount of planning could have prepared me for the reality of it. There was no going back now. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling but steady, "we need to talk. I know everything. Every lie, every message, every time you meddled in my relationship with Daniel. It ends today." Her face shifted immediately. For a moment, she looked confused, almost as if she hadn't heard me correctly. But that quickly changed to something darker, defensive, angry, almost calculating. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "You've lost your mind. There's nothing to talk about." But I wasn't backing down. Not this time. "I'm not going to let you lie to me anymore, Mum. I know about the messages you sent Daniel. I know about all the things you've been saying behind my back. You've been poisoning our relationship. And I'm done with it." She took a step back, her eyes darting to the side, as if trying to find a way out of this conversation, some way to avoid the truth. I could feel her scrambling, her carefully constructed facade of concern and love beginning to crack under the weight of my words. "No, no, Laura, you've got it all wrong," she said, her voice now cold, almost robotic. "I was just trying to help. I was worried about you. You were rushing into things with Daniel. He wasn't the right man for you, and I was only looking out for you." I shook my head, my chest tightening with frustration. "No, Mom, you weren't trying to help. You were trying to control me. You were manipulating me, making me doubt myself and Daniel. You've been doing it for years." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. For the first time, I saw her crack. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. She was searching for something to say, some way to justify the things she had done, but there was nothing left. "You've been telling him I doubted him," I continued, my voice shaking with the force of everything I was finally allowing myself to say. "You told him I wasn't ready for marriage. You told him I was unfaithful, that I didn't trust him, and you did it all behind my back." She let out a sharp laugh, a bitter sound that sent a chill through me. "I was just trying to protect you, Laura. You think I wanted you to make the same mistakes I did? I was trying to save you from the hurt, from the heartbreak, and you're choosing him over me, your own mother. I've given everything to raise you, and now you're just going to throw that all away?" I had to bite my lip to stop myself from screaming, from letting the anger consume me. "You think I'd throw everything away? You think I'm abandoning you because I'm choosing Daniel? No, Mom, I'm choosing peace. I'm choosing to heal. I'm choosing my marriage. I'm choosing myself."
Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I saw something like fear flicker in her gaze. It was fleeting, but it was there. Realization hitting her that I wasn't the same person I had been, that I wasn't the daughter she could control anymore. For the first time, she was the one on the defensive, and I had finally found the strength to stand my ground. "You can't just leave me like this," she whispered, the hurt in her voice cutting through me. "I'm your mother. You owe me." "I don't owe you this, Mum," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I owe it to myself, to Daniel, to our future, and I can't keep letting you tear us apart." She stood there, speechless, her face crumbling. I had never seen her look so vulnerable, so lost. But I knew it wasn't real. It wasn't guilt. It was something else, something darker, something that had always been there beneath the surface. It was the fear of losing control. I continued, "You've hurt me in ways you can't even understand, but I'm not the scared little girl who always took care of you anymore. I'm not going to let you keep doing this to me. I'm done." She took a shaky step back, as if my words had physically hit her. "Don't do this, Laura," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Please, don't walk away from me." But I had already made my choice. For the first time in my life, I was choosing myself. I was choosing peace. And I was choosing Daniel, the man I loved, the one who had never tried to tear me down, who had never played games with my trust. I was choosing a future where I didn't have to walk on eggshells, constantly questioning what was real and what wasn't. "I'm not walking away from you, Mom," I said, the words heavy with finality. "But I am setting boundaries, and that means I can't keep doing this with you." The silence that followed was deafening. She stood there, frozen, as if she couldn't process what had just happened, but I didn't back down. I wasn't going to give her the power to manipulate me any longer. "I hope you can understand one day," I said, my voice softening just a little, though I knew there was no going back from this. "But I can't keep letting you control me. Not anymore." With that, I turned and walked away. I left her standing there, in the ruins of the life I had spent so many years trying to protect. The world felt heavy, the weight of what I had just done pressing down on me. But at the same time, I felt lighter than I had in years. I had taken control of my life again. I had chosen to live in the truth, even if it meant walking away from the woman who had always been my world. And for the first time, I knew I was doing the right thing.
Looking back now, I realized that blood isn't an excuse for betrayal.
There's no rule that says family is above reproach. No invisible line that makes you blind to the flaws and dangers of the ones who raised you. For years, I had allowed my mother's influence to dictate my choices, to shape my sense of self, and to determine the course of my relationships. She was my mother, after all. I had been taught to revere her, to believe in the unshakable bond we shared. But now, after everything that had happened, I knew the painful truth. That bond was built on a foundation of manipulation and fear, not love. It was hard to admit, especially after everything I had given to our relationship. I had spent my entire life trying to protect her, keeping her secrets, believing in her version of the world. But in the end, I realized I had been protecting the wrong person, and it was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. I had to confront her. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind countless times, playing out every possible scenario. What would I say? How would I make her see what she'd done? How could I explain the depth of the hurt, the damage she'd caused to the woman who had always been my anchor? But no amount of planning could have prepared me for the reality of it. There was no going back now. "Mom," I said, my voice trembling but steady, "we need to talk. I know everything. Every lie, every message, every time you meddled in my relationship with Daniel. It ends today." Her face shifted immediately. For a moment, she looked confused, almost as if she hadn't heard me correctly. But that quickly changed to something darker. Defensive, angry, almost calculating. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her eyes narrowing. "You've lost your mind. There's nothing to talk about." But I wasn't backing down. "Not this time. I'm not going to let you lie to me anymore, Mom. I know about the messages you sent Daniel. I know about all the things you've been saying behind my back. You've been poisoning our relationship, and I'm done with it." She took a step back, her eyes darting to the side as if trying to find some way out of this conversation, some way to avoid the truth. I could feel her scrambling, her carefully constructed facade of concern and love beginning to crack under the weight of my words. "No, Laura, you've got it all wrong," she said, her voice now cold, almost robotic. "I was just trying to help you. I was worried about you. You were rushing into things with Daniel. He wasn't the right man for you, and I was only looking out for you." I shook my head, my chest tightening with frustration. "No, Mom, you weren't trying to help me. You were trying to control me. You were manipulating me, making me doubt myself and Daniel. You've been doing it for years." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. For the first time, I saw her crack. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but nothing came out. She was searching for something to say, some way to justify the things she'd done, but there was nothing left. "You've been telling him I doubted him," I continued, my voice shaking with the force of everything I was finally allowing myself to say. "You told him I wasn't ready for marriage. You told him I was unfaithful, that I didn't trust him. And you did it all behind my back." She let out a sharp laugh, a bitter sound that sent a chill through me. "I was just trying to protect you, Laura. You think I wanted you to make the same mistakes I did? I was trying to save you from the hurt, from the heartbreak, and you're choosing him over me, your own mother. I've given everything to raise you, and now you're just going to throw that all away?" I had to bite my lip to stop myself from screaming, from letting the anger consume me. "You think I'd throw everything away? You think I'm abandoning you because I'm choosing Daniel? No, Mom. I'm choosing peace. I'm choosing to heal. I'm choosing my marriage. I'm choosing myself." So, if you're listening to this, please know you're allowed to choose yourself. You're allowed to protect your peace, even from the people who raised you. It's not easy. It's heartbreaking. It may feel like the hardest thing you'll ever do, but it's also the most important thing you'll ever do for yourself. Setting boundaries isn't about pushing people away. It's about protecting the person you've become and the person you're still becoming. It's about allowing yourself the space to heal, to grow, and to live your life on your terms. For so long, I had believed that loyalty meant sacrificing my own needs, that loving my family meant putting myself last. But I've learned the true loyalty to yourself, to your happiness, to your marriage, means knowing when to say enough. It means recognizing when a relationship, no matter how much you love someone, has become toxic. And it means having the courage to walk away from that toxicity, even if it's hard, even if it hurts. As I stand here now, looking back at everything that's happened, I can honestly say I don't regret the decisions I've made. I don't regret standing up for myself, for Daniel, and for our future. And I don't regret choosing peace over all the drama, all the manipulation, and all the lies. The life I have now is one I've built from the ground up, brick by brick, and it's the one that finally feels like mine. So, if you're in a situation like I was, if you're struggling with toxic family dynamics or trying to hold on to a relationship that's draining you, just remember you're allowed to choose yourself. You don't have to carry the weight of someone else's burdens on your shoulders. You don't have to be the one to make everyone else happy at the expense of your own peace. It's okay to set boundaries. It's okay to walk away. And it's okay to choose a life that's filled with love, trust, and freedom. Because you deserve it. We all do. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss out on the next story. Please subscribe now to keep following more stories and turn on the notification bell to get exclusive updates straight to your inbox. Your support helps me keep creating these stories that speak to the heart.